All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another month of our Dig Your Dinner webinar series. My name is Anthony Reardon. I am the Horticulture Small Farms Extension Agent here in Johnson County. And today our topic is garden fresh okra. Okra, as you will come to find in this webinar, and I think it's been kind of a theme with our recent webinars, is that there's been some very simple to grow plants that we featured recently. So okra definitely falls into that category. It's an easy plant to grow once you kind of know the basics of it. But there are some interesting facets to be discussing and things to look into. So I'm going to talk about that, and then shortly after I'm done, we're going to hand it over to Chelsea King, who is our nutrition, food safety, and health agent, and she's going to talk about ways to serve it and nutrition and preservation methods. So with that said, feel free to throw any of your questions into the chat as we go along, and we will get to them. But I always like to promote some publications at the beginning of these when I am talking about them. So Kansas Garden Guide is always our go-to with many of our vegetables. Okra does have a page dedicated to it itself. If you would like a copy of this, we have them available in our office. That is a physical copy. They're around $50. But if you would like the free PDF version, you can just go to this link online in the K-State bookstore, or KSRE bookstore particularly, which is for research and extension, and you will be able to find this. Also, there's lots of great other publications from universities, extensions around the country. This one is from Iowa State, which is obviously very close to us here in the Kansas City area. So the growing conditions will be quite similar. And it kind of just walks you through all of the considerations you should be keeping in mind. So at a glance, okra, what do you need to know about it? Well, it is a plant that is actually native to Africa, and it became popular in the United States through the South. So it kind of was brought over to the United States, and became a very easy crop to grow because it likes the heat and it doesn't need too much water after it's established. And it can be a very prolific producer for you. So it's a good source of a lot of food. That said, it's easy to grow in Kansas, and that's a good feature to have because Kansas, obviously, as you know, has some wild climatic conditions. We can go from hot to cold. We can go from very wet to very dry. Every day is a new adventure when it comes to growing vegetables in the state. And okra is one that's better adapted to being able to handle any of those conditions. Even when it comes to the type of soil, it really doesn't, it's not too particular about it. That said, the actual part of the plant that you're going to be consuming here when you're looking at the okra is the actual remnants of what the flower was. It's the elongated seed structure that is kind of left behind after the flower is done. And the variety that you're going to be looking at or wanting to be looking at with these types of plants, you need to be keeping in mind several different types of attributes. So there are some that have spines that we'll talk about versus no spines. There are some that stay soft and don't actually get woody, no matter how large their seed pods get. And then also there are some that have a lot of yield. So we'll get into that shortly. But when you're planting okra, there's a handful of considerations to be keeping in mind. It's kind of falling into that category of, best practices with most of your vegetables. So, in general, a well-drained yet fertile soil, kind of like everything that we have here on the Great Plains, that's going to be your ideal spot. So don't try to go into rocky areas or clay areas. But even if you do have those, this is a plant that's hardier that can probably handle that. That said, it is a full sun plant like all of our vegetables, so you want that 6+ hours of direct sunlight a day so that it can properly photosynthesize and then develop those fruits. And then when you're spacing these plants in general, the recommended amount is 12 inches to 18 inches apart. Now, that said, okra is one that is usually planted in a high density type planting situation, meaning that you're going to be kind of pushing the limits of spacing them out. So instead of going that 18 inches, generally what you're going to see with your okra is that they're going to be kind of square foot planted, just one plant per foot, so that you can get as much of a yield as possible without taking up too much space. And because these are very vertical plants, generally speaking, depending on the variety you're working with, you're going to be able to do the maintenance that is associated with this pretty easily still, even if you are doing square foot gardening. Now, that said, you want to be aiming for mid-May planting, so literally right now. And this can be done either through sowing or transplants. So if you're sowing, it is going to take you obviously a little bit longer to get to a point where you're harvesting things. Um, but there are some aspects to be keeping in mind. So if you're sowing seeds, they are thicker seeds. So these are ones that you could actually take the seeds and soak them overnight before you ever try to plant them in the ground. And what they'll actually do is it'll help the water permeate sort of that woody husk that is around the actual genetic material within the seed itself. And then you can plant it into the ground, and it will essentially help that water absorb and help those roots establish a little bit easier. One of the unique things about okra seed in particular is that it is only viable for 2 years. So if you have seed packets that are old or something along those lines, you do want to be paying attention to the age of it, because this is a plant where old seed is really not going to be doing much for you, and it's better to just get new seed and start over. Also, keep in mind that soil temperature is a very prominent aspect to keep in mind when planting with this. Specifically, it needs to be at least 65 degrees in order for the plants to be germinating and really growing for you. So we're pretty much there right now here in mid-May, but we have been getting some colder days in general. So just be keeping in mind that soil temperature is going to really be dictating how this warm season crop is going to be performing for you. If it is cold out, or if you do have cold soil temperature, you're going to be seeing some delayed growth. And that applies not only to our sown seeds, but also to your transplant seedlings. So what about crop rotations? The one thing that's unique to okra specifically is that it really has no close relatives within your typical vegetable garden. So that being said, the only thing that you need to crop rotate with your okra is okra itself. So if you had it planted there last year, don't plant it in that spot, but plant it somewhere else. But you don't have to worry about it being related to tomatoes or something else along those lines, because it's not. And so there's more opportunities to have spaces for it to be planted. Because it is such a unique plant that doesn't have any close relatives in the garden, it actually makes it a strong candidate for those off-year crop rotations. So say you had a specific crop grown here, like tomatoes last year, and you don't want to have anything related to tomatoes planted this year. Well, nothing's related to okra, so you can plant that okra there this year, and you won't necessarily have those carryover issues. That said, if you are interested, it's actually related to hollyhocks. So when it comes to okra varieties, know that most of them do well in Kansas. There are some attributes that people typically try to look for. So there's spineless varieties. When I say spines, if you've ever handled like a sunflower before, and you see kind of those pointy hairs that you can kind of get them caught in your skin, or they can kind of irritate your skin, that's what we mean by spines on okra. So keep that in mind, that those spines are variety dependent. Some of them have a lot of them, and some of them have none. So just look for that when you are considering different varieties. Also know that some of them actually have pods that don't ever get woody. You can get very large pods that are up to actually over a foot long that are really, massive fruit, and they will remain soft. So it does kind of just depend on again on the variety, as far as how that fruit develops. And then also keep in mind that there are some that will branch more, and more branching is going to mean more fruit for harvest for you. So definitely keep that in mind as you're looking for how much okra you're actually wanting to be harvesting. Some of the recommended varieties here, we have the Annie Oakley, which is compact and early and spineless, meaning that it is going to be very good for smaller gardeners, because you've got essentially a very easy harvest there, and it's going to take up the least amount of space, and also you can kind of work around it without it irritating your skin. The red burgundy is one of the more ornamental varieties out there. So those are the ones that you're going to see that are more purple. And it's going to be less productive, but it's going to be very pretty. So if you're trying to integrate something sort of into almost an ornamental bed that can then be used as a vegetable, red burgundy would be a great option. It's not spineless, so you want to keep that in mind. And also generally keep in mind that with any of these sort of red to purple colors, when you cut them up and cook them, it's going to lose that color. In this case, it is going to be churning back to green, but you'll see sometimes, especially with like peppers, with like a purple pepper, they'll turn brown. So there's a reason that a lot of producers won't actually grow those because restaurants won't take them because a brown pepper looks gross to people. So keep that in mind if you're trying to do this for culinary reasons. Cajun Delight is high yield, early, and spineless. Clemson Spineless is obviously spineless, but it's very easy, very adaptable. That's actually kind of considered the gold standard when it comes to your okra. So if there's one that you're looking for, like an old, reliable variety, Clemson Spineless is the one that has been. And then Old Emerald is actually pretty unique in that you don't actually get sort of that ribbing on the fruit itself. It's more of a round fruit. So it's more cylindrical almost. So very smooth round pods and a good texture to it. So okra fertilization in general, it is one of those plants that you really want to be watching for your nitrogen highs. Again, kind of comparing to a tomato here. If you put too much nitrogen onto tomato, you're going to get a vast shrubby plant because it's going to produce all of these leaves using up those nitrogen. But when it does that, it's pushing all of its energy towards producing those leaves, and it's not pushing that energy towards producing fruit. Same concept here. You're not going to be getting much fruit, but you're going to get a very shrubby or tall plant. So a low range fertilizer is best for your okra. Generally, what is recommended is 1 to 2 pounds of a 10-10-10, which is your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium per 100 square feet. And so when it comes to watering and care, as I mentioned, this can be a very drought tolerant plant. When we say drought tolerant, that always means after the roots have established. So you need to get your plants established first before you start backing off on watering. Now, that said, once they are established, it still is going to need a periodic deep watering, but it's not going to have to be super frequent. It's about every 7 to 10 days you'll want to come in and really deep water those plants, and then you can back off and let it do its thing. Later in the season, what actually happens with your okra because it grows vertically is some varieties they can get up to 6 to 8 feet tall, and that's just unmanageable for a lot of people. I'm 5'7". I'm not reaching 8 feet up to harvest okra. So what you can actually do is trim the plant back later in the season, probably late July, mid-August, somewhere around there, to about 1 to 2 feet tall. And what it's going to do at that point is you're going to have a really thick stalk. It's going to look like it's struggling for probably a couple weeks, but after it gets out of that phase, you're going to see sort of this clumping growth like you see on the right here, where all of that fruit is sort of producing right at the top, but you're not having to reach to harvest it anymore. So when it comes to harvesting your okra in general, you want to be obviously careful with it. Some varieties, again, have those spines, so a good measure is just to have some gloves on so you don't get that skin irritation. If you do happen to have some pods in there that are, overripe or they're hard and woody, those can actually be quite sharp. So having some kind of gloves on or even rose gloves to prevent sort of being scratched by those, that can help you out. The key to harvesting okra always is to try to harvest them when they are tender and not woodies. And really, I've said a couple of times that it's variety dependent, but it's almost always that they are going to turn woody if they are too large. So usually no longer than your finger, which is about 4 inches. Um, so that is when you're going to want to try to get them off of there. And if they don't get off of there, then we're going to have some other issues we'll talk about in the next slide. But always try to use a knife and or pruners, and this is going to just create a clean cut for you to get those off of your stem without ripping your stem. And then also try to handle those carefully afterwards because they actually can bruise quite easily. So, kind of just gently snip them off and then go ahead and move on to your next fruits. Also, I did want to mention they are very, very prolific producers. So, with that in mind, you're probably going to have to be harvesting every other day when these are into the heat of the growing season. So I mentioned some hazards. This looks like it's zoomed in. It's really not. Those things can get up to be a foot to a foot and a half tall. And that, when it is overripe, is essentially a solid wood sharp structure. Sometimes they can split and those spines are still solid wood. So it can be very sharp. It can hurt to deal with. Also, when those are left on there, it's sapping energy away from your plant. It's still pushing energy towards the growth of that instead of producing new fruit for you to harvest. So The more you can stay on top of these and stay on top of your harvest and not, ignore that every other day harvesting, the more production you're going to have and the less, sharp objects or splitting or woody material you're going to have. And when it comes to pests and disease for your okra, it's very limited. There's really only two issues that are worth noting necessarily, and that's your aphids and your root knot nematode, both of which are easily manageable. So with aphids, you'd be looking at anything that kind of treats for those piercing, sucking mouth parts. So neem oil alternated with an insecticidal soap is really the recommended organic approach because it's going to make it so that they don't develop a resistance if you're doing that alternation. Strong jets of water are also something that are occasionally recommended with your aphids because they are tiny enough they can be blasted off of the plants. They can also be potentially squished by the pressure of the water. And so when it comes to your root knot nematode, these are a little bit more difficult to be addressing, unfortunately. It is, a microscopic worm that is down in the soil itself, and then once it gets into the plant matter, it clogs the arteries, and you start seeing these sort of tumorous growths on them. And when those arteries are clogged, it essentially stops the flow of water and nutrients to the plants eventually. So ways that you can get around this, you want to do some crop rotation, not plant in the same location. Soil solarization is probably your most effective tool in this instance. And that is when you would cover the planting area with a tarp and you would have to essentially let it'd be a black tarp, you'd have it pinned down, and you would have to let the heat of the sun cook the soil underneath for a very long time. During the summer, it's about 3 months. During the winter, it's about 6 months. That said, it is so effective by cooking the soil with that heat that it is going to kill every single thing underneath, including your nematodes, but also your any other kinds of pests that you may have, any weed problems you may have, and also your beneficial microorganisms that live in your soil there. So that said, you do actually want those beneficial microorganisms there. So after you treat a soil plot with a solarization technique, what you actually need to do is come back in with a compost because compost is generated through soil microorganisms. So adding that compost, you're going to reintroduce those microorganisms. You're going to basically bring life back into your soil so that your plants can form those beneficial relationships that ultimately equate to nutrient uptake. And then also here I have listed marigolds. Marigolds are one of the few companion plants that have actually been proven to secrete a chemical that will kill root knot nematodes. So you can try interplanting with marigolds and it will treat for a root knot nematode. Then something fun before I hand this over to Chelsea. And as I mentioned, it's a little bit shorter on my end today because okra is a very easy crop to grow. But did you know okra is in the same plant family as ornamental rose of Sharon and hibiscus? So if you look closely at the flower bases, you'll see that these structures are very similar to an okra pod, and this is why. So with that, I will welcome questions. And if we don't have any, I'll pass it to Chelsea.
Hello, everyone. As Anthony said, my name is Chelsea King. I am the Nutrition, Food Safety, and Health Agent here in Johnson County, and I'm going to talk about nutrition, kind of growing okra, or the what do you do with the okra after you've grown it. So to get started, always talking about the nutrition, okra is kind of a nutrition powerhouse, like most of our produce, our fruits and vegetables are. It is low in calories. At 1 cup is about 33 calories. We have 7 grams of carbohydrates, so it is a low carbohydrate food if you are watching carbohydrates due to choice or diabetes, whatever it might be. There isn't a lot of protein, but there is some protein at 2 grams of protein per 1 cup. It's got 3 grams of fiber, which is a pretty good amount for 1 cup of our okra. And then we have a pretty good supply of our vitamins and minerals. Here's just a few highlighted. Vitamin C and K, both are over 25% of our daily value. Folate, which is at 15% of our daily value. Magnesium and vitamin B6 are about 14 and 13% respectively. And it is a pretty high water food at 90% of its content is water. So the health benefits of okra, we know that okra, most of our green plants are pretty rich in the chlorophyll. We also know that they're rich in antioxidants and polyphenols, and the purple is even more rich in those antioxidants and rich in anthocyanins. Most of our purple fruits and vegetables are going to have that higher anthocyanins, and they're a little more heart health protective, but our green okra still rich in antioxidants and plenty of beneficial compounds. We know that okra can support some healthy blood sugars. It is low glycemic, and as I mentioned, it has a decent amount of fiber as well as lower carbohydrate. So therefore, it's not going to spike the blood sugar quite as high as some other fruits or vegetables might. We talked about the vitamin K and magnesium in the previous slide, and that supports bone health, can support immune health, with about 25% of our daily vitamin C being found in okra. And then may support cardiovascular function, which goes back to those antioxidant properties, as well as digestion and gut health. Again, the fiber that we find in that. So the purple okra, which Anthony had mentioned, it is very pretty and decorative. And it tastes a little bit more mild than our green okra. So the green okra has been described as having a little bit more of that earthy flavor, where that purple okra is going to be a little bit more mild and less earthy. Um, as I mentioned before, there is going to be greater antioxidants and anthocyanins. However, those often are lost when you cook them. And as Anthony mentioned, our purple okra does turn green when cooked. So you can grow purple okra for the health benefits. However, some of that is lost during that cooking process. But you still are retaining the same amount of the other vitamins and minerals and the good components you get from the green one. So if you just like the color in your garden, you can still grow it and you're still going to get those nutritional benefits. The one key difference with the purple okra and the green okra, outside of kind of the taste, is that the purple okra pods actually remain tender even when they're grown to a larger size. So if you are somebody who is not going to be out there pruning every day, like Anthony had mentioned, then maybe the purple variety is a little bit better because you can let them get a little bit larger and they're not going to get as woody as that green okra might. So just again, another consideration, not from the nutrition standpoint, but from the culinary standpoint and what's really feasible for you and your harvesting practices and how frequently you might be able to be cooking and using it. So interesting enough, the young leaves and flowers actually can also be harvested and consumed. They're not consumed very often, but they are edible, and you can certainly, if you want to have that kind of stalk or the leaves, consuming those. The flowers are edible, and often flowers of plants are added to salads to add visual appeal and decoration. So all of that is edible in addition to the pods. I've never tasted them, so I can't say specifically how they are tasting, but it would be interesting to try. And I'm sure just like all of your other leaves that you can consume, your beet leaves and things like that, sauteing them and seasoning them up is probably going to be the best way to consume them. As Anthony had mentioned as well, pods are consumed best when they're 2 to 4 inches long. That is because they are less fibrous. So if you've ever had an okra that's too long, you're trying to cut it and slice it to saute or to put in a dish, it just does not work. So if you have the longer pods, they are going to be fibrous and inedible. You can try to cut off some of that, but for the most part, that whole plant isn't going to be salvageable. It's difficult. Like sometimes you can cut off just a section that's bad in some plants, but this it really is kind of woody and fibrous throughout the whole plant. Okra is often prepared grilled, broiled, fried, deep fried, sautéed, and stewed. So those are just some of the different ways, not all of the ways, of course. Fried okra is probably the most common, where it's breaded and consumed that way. Storaging. So you do want to make sure that you store these unwashed in a paper towel. So keeping the okra dry is really going to be key when you're storing it in your refrigerator. You also want to allow for that air circulation and store in that refrigerator for about 3 to 4 days or so. The reason that you want to keep them unwashed in a paper towel, you want to keep the moisture off because it will deteriorate the product. Like most of our produce, we want to make sure that we're keeping moisture off because the moisture will make that product deteriorate quicker and you won't be able to use it. So you may be wondering, or if you've cooked okra before, and some people don't like okra for the fact that it is slimy. So why is that? Mucilage is a natural gel-like substance that is made up of pectin and soluble fiber, which is basically the fiber. As I mentioned, there's 3 grams of fiber in 1 cup. It is what gives okra its slimy texture when it's cooked. However, that's not a bad thing. Some people the texture throws off, but it does actually have a really good nutritional purpose. So mucilage slows the digestion and absorption of our carbohydrates, which is why I also mentioned that it was low glycemic and great for people who are maybe trying to manage their carbohydrates and their blood sugars better. So it slows the digestion absorption of the carbohydrates. And then research has shown that the mucilage slows the release of glucose into the bloodstreams and actually can help bind to our bile acids and our cholesterol and excrete them, which helps to lower our heart health risk. So it's going to get rid of that cholesterol. It's going to make sure that our lipids are staying at a good, healthy level. So again, another benefit of eating okra, the texture may be a little slimy, but there is a good reason, and that sliminess actually has some beneficial health impacts for us. So, just some fun facts here. We won't really necessarily see this in the US, but maybe if you grow your own okra, you might want to try it. But there are some other culinary uses for okra. The seeds specifically, in certain countries, the okra seeds are roasted and used as a coffee substitute due to their unique flavor. They are kind of caffeine free, so some places will roast them and use them as a coffee substitute for just another different type of beverage. This is mostly in your African countries. And then the other thing is you can't actually press the seeds into an oil. And so compared to walnut and peanut oil, it is actually higher in polyphenols, minerals, and vitamins. And so again, another use, I did look online. You can buy okra seed oil online. So I'm not sure, I don't remember the price or anything, but again, just another unique kind of use when we think about often things go wasted. This plant really does have most of its components that are edible or used in different facets. All right, so now moving on to some of the preservation and recipes. So you can preserve okra via some home preservation methods. The home canning method, you do want to make sure you are pressure canning okra. It is a low acid food, so therefore you need to have that higher pressure and the higher temperature to make it safe. You can use a water bath if you are pickling. So I do have a recipe that I'll show you at the end here based on that. But if you're just doing plain okra, not pickled, then you need to do the pressure canning. You need about 11 pounds of okra for 7 pints. And you do want to make sure you're using those younger, tender pods. Again, we do not want any pods that are too long and are going to be too woody. The preservation method is not going to make them less woody. They're going to be the same woodiness when you take them out of the jar after you've canned them. You'll want to wash your pods and trim your ends, and then you can either leave them whole or you can cut them into 1 inch pieces. The key here is that you do want to do what we call like a hot pack method. And so you're going to boil that okra for about 2 minutes in a saucepan, and you're going to want to drain that water. You're going to fill then the hot okra into your jars, and you can add salt if you so desire. And then you're going to cover the okra in the jars. And here's the key, with fresh boiling water. So remember, I talked about that mucilage and kind of the sliminess. Some of that's going to seep out into that water during that 2 minute boil process. So you do want to add fresh water into your jar just to make sure that you are having a clear liquid and that you are having a good long-term shelf storage option. And then you're going to adjust your lids and process. And then you're going to process based on if you're using a dial or weighted gauge. And then you're going to adjust for your altitude. You can also dehydrate okra. So the rating for dehydrating okra, according to the National Center for Home Food Preservation, is fair to good. I lived in Africa for about 2 years, and they actually grew a lot of okra and then dehydrated it. They did kind of just the sun drying method. And I would say that they had pretty good success with dehydrating their okra. Now, how you use it after it's dehydrated, just know that obviously the texture when it rehydrates will be a little bit different. Same thing, you're going to want to use those young tender pods, but you do not want to blanch before drying. Some vegetables recommend that you blanch them before you do that air dry or that dehydrating process, but you do not want to blanch these before drying them. You're going to slice them pretty thin into about an eighth to a quarter inch thick discs, and you're going to dry for about 8 to 10 hours at 135 to maybe 145 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll know when the okra is done, when it's brittle and snaps easily and kind of feels completely dry to the touch. No tackiness, no stickiness. Some ways to use dehydrated okra is some people actually just use it as kind of a crunchy snack. And if you do this, you can salt and kind of season the okra before you dry it. You seasoning it after it won't really have that same impact. The seasoning is just going to fall right off. Or you can add it to soups, gumbos, and stews, basically any dish that you're going to have a liquid that's going to serve as a rehydration purpose. And then you can freeze okra as well. Certain varieties freeze better. So the smooth type variety freezes as well or better than the ridged varieties. Just know that they don't split quite as easily. Same thing in this method. You want to use those young tender pods. And the National Center for Home Food Preservation actually recommends that when you remove the stem end, you want to cut enough off that you are not actually exposing the seed cell. So you want to keep that seed cell basically enclosed. That's going to just help with that long-term storage and prevent that freezer degradation and things like that. You are going to then blanch your small pods for about 3 minutes and large pods for longer, 4 minutes. And then once you blanch them, you can either choose to slice them crosswise or you can leave them whole. So again, that seed stem, because seed stem intact, you are blanching them. So by not allowing water into that seed cell during that blanching process, it's going to help with that long-term storage in the freezer. And then if you are going to preserve them for frying after, once you've done the whole process of the blanching and then slicing crossways, you can then dredge them with like your meal or your flour, and then you can spread them onto a single tray and do like a little bit of a flash freeze. So you're going to freeze them until they're firm. And then once they're firm, you can transfer them to a airtight container, and then you'll just be able to pull out what you need at that time for the frying purposes. One thing about freeze-dried okra or freeze okra is that the texture does change a bit, so it's not going to be quite the same. It is going to be yet best used in probably your soups, your stews, anything that you're cooking. It's not going to be a great option. Potentially, you could saute or roast in the oven. You'll just want to do it at that high heat. There is going to be some degradation just from the cells breaking down that layer when it's being frozen and then thawed. So here's a few recipes. So as I mentioned, you can do okra, just a pickled okra. If you aren't into a pressure cooking method, you can certainly pickle dill your okra. So here's kind of the directions and the ingredients. You need some okra, some hot peppers, dill seed and garlic cloves, and then your pickling salt, water, and vinegar. As I mentioned, you're going to kind of do the whole process. The peppers, dill seed, water, and vinegar is basically your brine. And so you're going to heat that in a pot, and then you're going to pour that hot pickling solution over your okra once it's in the jars. And then you're going to process in a boiling water bath canner for only about 10 minutes or 15 minutes if you're above an elevation of 1,000 feet. Here is a recipe for a Mediterranean okra stew and tomatoes and hot peppers. So we often think about okra and tomatoes and peppers together. It's a very Southern type style dish, but this takes a different spin and uses a little bit different of a seasoning profile. And so it's more Mediterranean based. We have olive oils, onion, any hot pepper of your choice, some seasonings. We have allspice, coriander, paprika, and then we have our crushed tomatoes and broth and a little bit of that lime at the end. So the process is you're going to saute your peppers and your onions, and you're going to cook them until they're soft, and then you're going to add your garlic after that for about a minute. We usually add garlic in after because we don't want that garlic to burn. Then you're going to add your okra and you're just going to saute it a little bit. You want to develop that color, that nice caramelization that happens. And then you're going to add the remaining seasonings, your crushed tomatoes, and your broth. And then basically you're going to add just a little bit of a sliced tomato on top of the stew just for some decoration and some more flavoring. And you're going to simmer until your okra is soft. Now, at this point, you could also add some cooked shrimp or chicken If it is raw, I don't recommend adding it because that obviously will change your cooking time. So you could have your cooked shrimp and your cooked chicken set aside and then add it during that simmering process or at the end before serving. And then you're going to add some lime juice. And this is really good served over rice, served with any protein of your choice, maybe served with like some naan bread or something like that as well. You could even add chickpeas or some other type of bean to it. And then we have a crispy okra and tomato salad. So a lot of people, as I mentioned, don't like the okra because of that sliminess. And so this recipe actually slices the okra into thin like little slivers. It is best using a mandolin, but if you're skilled with your knife, you could also just slice it really thin the long way. So we're not cutting it into circular kind of spheres, or excuse me, circular cubes. We are cutting it into long, thin slices. So you're going to slice up your okra into those long, thin slices, and then you're just going to kind of saute them and cook them in a little bit of oil. We're not doing like a deep fry where you're going to have 4 cups of oil or anything like that. We're just adding enough oil into the bottom of the pan that maybe a half an inch or something like that. And we're just going to kind of crisp up the okra pods in that oil. And then you're going to remove it and kind of let all that extra oil get absorbed on a paper towel. And then we have a kind of lemon yogurt dressing. So once you mix up your lemon yogurt dressing, you're going to drizzle it over your chopped tomatoes, you have some feta cheese, and then your fried okra pods. And then we have a summer okra, corn, and tomato salad. So if you've ever had like a zucchini, corn, tomato, like sauteed salad before, this is kind of the same concept except using with okra. So of course, bacon, right? So using some bacon, you could omit the bacon or you could use turkey bacon if you wanted to, but you would kind of cook up your bacon and then you would remove a good amount of that bacon grease, just leaving a little bit to saute some of those vegetables for a little bit of that flavoring. And then you're going to saute your okra, your jalapeno. That's optional. You could certainly leave that out. And then I like to use some fresh sweet corn where you're just kind of chopping it off of the cob. However, you could certainly use frozen or canned. And then you're going to saute that in a skillet as so it gets that nice kind of charred color almost, and you're going to develop some of those flavors that way. And then after that's cooked, you're going to add it to a bowl and add your diced up tomatoes, your purple onion, and then your juice of a lime for a little extra flavoring. And with that, that is the end of my presentation. As always, here's my contact information and our In Good Health newsletter. And if there are any questions, we are happy to answer. All right, I'm not seeing anything, Anthony, so you can wrap it up.
Okay, thank you, Chelsea. Yes, we will be back soon with another Dig Your Dimmer webinar. I believe the one that we are offering next month is actually in person. So if you're interested in that, please be sure to check out our website at Johnson County Extension, and you can go ahead and register there. And then we will be back later in the summer with more fun topics in the Dig Your Dinner webinar series. Thank you for joining us today.